Welcome to the podcast edition of The Best of the Archive Room so far.
The Nation Station, Manx Radio.
Fastamai, and welcome to this special Boxing Day visit to the Archive Room, Manx Radio's nest of nostalgia, the place we keep stories of island life in years gone by, told by the people who were there. I'm Judith Lay, and I'd love you to join me now to listen again to a few of my favourite characters, like Cissy O'Brien and Inkerman Faragher, Laura Briggs, Charlie Webster and Geoff Cannell, and Leslie Garrett on the Calf of Man. So come on in and close the door, and let's take another gentle stroll down Manx memory lane. This is the melody of the traditional Manx carol Trefarugit Christ, When Christ Was Born, and it's quite a fitting choice as our first story is all about a rather unusual Christmas carol choir practice. Laurie Davies was born in Wallasey in 1915, but developed a great love for the island through many childhood family holidays here. And after qualifying as a teacher and marrying, he and his wife moved here in 1947 and never left. When we join this story, Laurie is the physics teacher in Park Road School in Douglas.
When I started there, we had a carol service up at Ballacameen. We had another one at Park Road, because neither building had a hall which could accommodate both lots. Mm-hmm. When I became organist at St Thomas's, and the vicar of St Thomas's was also on the Board of Education, George Duckworth. So I said to him, would you mind if we had a combined carol service for the girls' high school here? Not at all. So I had a word on the headmistress and the music teachers, and they thought this was a good idea. Mm. And so Thursday afternoon, the end of term, Christmas term, we had a combined carol service, a united school carol service. Well, we hadn't asked the parents to come, but they did. And the previous Sunday, the bishop had been taking a service at St Thomas's. He told me about a carol service from a girls' school he'd heard on the wireless. How good it was, I said, but it's nothing compared with what is going to be here on Thursday. Well, he knew nothing about it, so I told him, he said, oh, well, I'll come.
Yes.
And the church was absolutely packed. Chairs everywhere, people standing.
Yeah.
And it was a great success, and ever after we had two services, one for the children in the afternoon, one for the parents in the evening.
Yes. When you started then in 1947 at Park Road, who would be the head teacher?
It was Miss Naylor. Oh yes, Miss Naylor.
She was there for a long time, wasn't she?
She was there for a long time, and by the X, she knew what was going on in her school.
Yeah.
She never had to look at the timetable on the wall. She knew where everybody should be at any particular time.
It's a name that's outstanding in Manx teaching, I think, isn't
yes,
it? Yes,
well, eventually, after she'd gone, a teak seat was put in the playground at Park Road in her memory, and referred to as Miss Naylor's teak seat.
She was quite a tough lady.
She stood for no nonsense whatsoever. After her time, at morning assembly, it was taken either by the headmistress or her deputy. There were two deputies, one for Park Road, one for Ballacameen. And if neither of them were available, I used to take morning assembly, you see.
Oh, yes.
And about a couple of days before the end of Christmas term, I'd taken the assembly because Miss Kelly had been called away for a telephone call. We finished assembly and we were just coming out, and Miss Kelly appeared and said, no, they're all to go back in again. I said, what's to do? She said, there's been a bomb alert for the school, and the police are coming to go through the place, and the girls are to stay in the hall. Well, my teacher training had never said, what do you do when you've got 450 girls suddenly loaded on you? Well, I have used what is known in the trade as an arrow prayer. Yeah. And the Lord said to me, well, it's a carol service 2 days' time. You've got carols in your hymn book. Practice them. So we practiced carols one half singing one verse, the other half singing another verse, the staff singing a verse, and all the rest of it.
Yeah, that would have to go on for some time then.
It went on for a very long time. I was getting desperate. Unfortunately, Miss Kelly appeared and said, well, that's all right now, you can come out now.
But, I mean, with the bomb alert today, everyone had to go outside a building, wouldn't they?
Oh, yes. Not Park Road. It takes more than the bomb to break Park Road. I think the Board of Education have been trying to get rid of it for a long time, but they haven't succeeded. Other buildings have come and gone. Well, the acting headmistress said, no, not a word to the children about what's happened. So I said, well, look, if we don't tell them, there are going to be rumours. The police were looking for drugs or stolen property or what have you.
Right.
She said, we'll tell them. So we did. That was, I think, one of the most exciting points of my career.
It'd be exciting for the children as well, wouldn't it?
But they didn't know what was happening. They just knew they were singing carols.
Laurie Davies, a teacher, church organist and a regular contributor to Manx Radio's religious broadcasting in years gone by. And there's one thing that links all our stories together today, and it's the wonderfully gifted David Collister, who spent long hours chatting to people and helping them to share their stories. What a legacy David has left behind for us and for future generations to learn from and enjoy. Local businesses advertising on Manx Radio has always been important to the life of the station. And once upon a time, our own highly professional commercial production team made all the advertisements right here in Broadcasting House.
The year 1477. William Caxton's putting the final touches to his first print run. Mr. Caxton.
What is it?
We've got a... It's going to be hard work.
This could be a good one, this.
Ready, let's go. Action, on the light.
Go, right.
The year 1477. William Caxton's putting the final touches to his first print run. Mr. Caxton.
What is it, man?
Ready? Track 3. All right, ready.
I wonder if that advertisement ever did get made.
The year is 1477. William Caxton has put in the final touches to his first print run. Mr. Caxton.
What is it, man?
We've just got a huge order for colour printing.
But I've only just invented the press. Black is all I've got.
It's for thousands, and they want it by Wednesday.
Tell him to phone Bridson and Horrocks.
But the phone won't be invented until 1876.
Good. Then we're not pressed for time. Aye? Pressed for time, eh? Get it, yeah? Aye? Pressed for time, yeah? Good job.
Mayhem in the production suite at Manx Radio, remembering the days when our commercials were made in-house.
Manx Radio, from the wonderful Isle of Man.
Well, there's lots of laughter in the archive room. Either the story itself is funny or the skill of the storyteller makes something quite ordinary into something very entertaining. But there are some darker stories too. Laura Briggs, wife of Inkerman farmer and former captain of the parish Harvey Briggs, left school just after the outbreak of the Second World War and straight away joined the Women's Land Army. After enlisting, Laura spent some weeks at Knockalow.
When I was at Knockalow, I used to go to Peel to the pictures. It was only a little cinema. One night, it must have been in September or October of 41, a notice came on the screen, would all military men report back to camp immediately. We didn't know what was on, but when I got out of the cinema, I realised that there was something radically wrong. Found out afterwards that the internees had rioted, and the noise was dreadful. You wouldn't have thought it was a human noise at all. It was a terrible noise. I can't really describe it because there was such a volume of it. And in those days, of course, there was no traffic, so of course you would hear it much more. And I was glad to get out of Peel and back to my digs at Patrick that night.
Nobody would hear about this. I mean, it wouldn't be reported, would it?
No, but I was talking once about this, and Mrs. Betty Hanson said, now, I remember very well the night that Laura's talking about. I was out with my father and mother, and we came back, and it was a horrifying noise. And she said there were ordinary soldiers guarding these men at that time, and the government decided, I suppose it was the powers that be across, decided that they would get the Metropolitan Police over from London, and there were a terrific number sent to Peel to guard these men. There were also Mosley's men there, And I think that's what must have happened. They had started this riot. Anyway, they got the Metropolitan Police over to guard them.
Well, while you were doing all this, Mr. Howie was desperately trying to get people into the Women's Land Army, and the numbers were never achieved anything like what they wanted, were they?
Oh no, the girls just didn't want to. If they were over 18, of course, it was easier to join one of the services, like the Navy, the Naval School over here, or the Air Force.
Didn't they hold a big parade to try to drum up interest in the land girls?
Yes, but it wasn't a success. Unfortunately, they timed it on a Saturday afternoon, thinking that people would be in town. But the trouble being that it was a wet afternoon. And the band, which was supposed to precede us from the bus station, the old bus station, over to the Villa Marina, refused to come out in case it ruined their instruments. So therefore, we had to march on our own.
In silence?
Yes. And then most of the shoppers were going home at that time. And of course, anybody working in town would want to get home, so they weren't going to go and watch.
You researched this many, many years after, of course, and statistics and figures have been difficult to come by, have they?
Yes, the records seem to have been destroyed. I mean, there were quite a lot of girls out on the farms that hadn't been through Knockhello, so their names weren't on the payroll. But they had the uniform just the same as we did.
Looking back at it now, was it really a tough time for most girls?
It was. To start off working in the fields for long hours, heavy work. In the summertime, you got the best of the weather. In the wintertime, you got the worst of it.
If you had to do it again, would you look forward to it or not?
Well, I've been doing it for the last 50 years.
It was training for you, wasn't it?
Yes.
When David Collister chatted to Inkerman Faragher and Ellen O'Brien, he discovered that they had much more in common than both being born in Douglas in the early 1920s. Both of them spent much of their childhood in the children's home in Douglas. 10-year-old Ellen following the death of her mother, and 12-year-old Inkerman following the cruel loss of both his parents within a few weeks of each other. But first, what's in a name?
Now, where does Inkerman come from then?
Inkerman is actually from the Crimean War. During that particular time, there was an officer from the Crimean War, from the Battle of Inkerman in actual fact, who was down at Santon visiting people. And my people originated from Santon, and one of them gave birth to a child who was a boy, and he asked if the child could be named Inkerman, and Inkerman was placed on it, and it's been there in parts of the family on and off. My father was Inkerman, and I have a nephew whose second name is Inkerman.
So that's Inkerman Faragher, known affectionately as Inky. But what about Ellen O'Brien?
Was Ellen a common name for a girl when you were born?
Yes, it was. Ellen Van, but it was spelt E-N, not A-N.
And then you became Cissy. When did you become Cissy?
God knows. I don't know. I think it was just family giving their own nicknames.
Where did you go to school then?
Hanover Street. And then when Mother died, we were put in a children's home, and I went to Muddy's Road School.
How old were you when your mother died?
10, on my 10th birthday. Died of TB.
That must have been a terrible shock to you at 10.
It was. I came home from school. I said, she shouldn't have done that. Broke my heart, that.
Yeah.
You see, at 10, in them days, you were 10. If you're 10 these days, you're 20. Got a head on you like a 20-year-old. Yeah, broke my heart, that.
Yeah. You had brothers and sisters, so some of you had to go in the children's home then?
Yes. My sister older than me, and my brother younger than me. We went in the children's home, but the other two, Tommy and Annie, were too old to go in.
And that's their biggest shared experience. Both Cissy O'Brien and Inkerman Faragher grew up in the children's home in Douglas.
The worst thing that happened to you when you were growing up, of course, was when you lost your mother and father within a short period.
I was about 12 at the time, and I lost my mother on the 23rd of February, and I lost my father on the 7th of March. That was a fortnight. Had quite an impact, actually.
So that's when you were put to the children's home?
We were put to the children's home.
That was up just past the grandstand, wasn't it, on the other side?
That's right.
What do you remember of those days then in the children's home?
I remember a lot about it in actual fact. The first thing about it was the fact that the family, we were split up, see the boys and the girls. The girls went over to what was called the girls' house, and that's the house which is over on the Greenfield roadside, and the boys were in the main building. So that made a difference too. We were separated basically, and the basic time we ever seen each other was breakfast time, because they used to come over to the main house, and meal times. Other than that, we had no connection whatsoever. But the children's home, I think basically I have a lot to thank them for. They sorted me out in my mind in respect to the suddenness of what had actually happened and the fact of going there. Life was strict to a degree. We had a number, we all had numbers, and I never forget mine. 33 was my number, and that was on the lockers, it was on everything you had, and that was it. And the routine basically at that time, you'd be up about 7 o'clock to 7:30. You'd had to get washed, dressed and everything like that. You'd go in for breakfast.
In a big dining room with big wooden tables. You had porridge, it was that thick. You could slice it, and a slice of toast.
And then you come out and you were inspected. And we would go to Murray's Road School, and we used to walk down. We used to be all lined up and walk down with one of the staff with us. We'd walk down to Murray's Road School. At 12 o'clock, they'd be there waiting, and we'd walk back to the children's home, have something to eat. Then we'd walk back to Murray's Road again. At night time, coming out of school, we'd walk back to the children's home.
Yeah.
Oh, God, I remember Inky very well. Yes, I still see him now.
You're a tough generation, aren't you?
Oh, God, yes, we were. We were made tough in the children's home.
We would be in bed by 8 o'clock at the latest, and between the time of after having tea, there would be a playroom there. Used to have you play there. Then one of the staff would come, and you'd have to start getting bathed now, in age groups and everything like that.
They looked after you as best they could.
They looked after us. They looked after us and fed us well and clean clothes and everything, but there was no affection. I missed it. I missed them. No, somebody that would hear me prayers at night, like my mother used to, and then took me in. That's what I really missed that. No, if you fell and cut your knee, well, you got on with it. Nobody cuddled you or said, oh, come on, you'll get better soon. There was no affection whatsoever.
No.
They were very cold. So we made pals of each other.
Your father would be able to visit you, would he?
Oh, yes, he visited us once a month. We used to have a concert every year, and all the kids went in it. And they had us up in the gym where there was a big stage, and they painted an old-fashioned fireplace, and 2 of the kids were sitting in rocking chairs each side. And I was standing there, and I was singing, just a song at twilight. And my father was sitting in the front row crying his eyes out. Yeah.
Just a song at twilight, when the lights are low, and the flickering shadows softly come and go. Though the heart be weary, sad the day and long, still to us at twilight comes love's old song, comes love's old sweet song.
Inkerman Faragher remembers being in that same gym at Christmas, but his memories are very different.
In Glencrutchy Road on Christmas Day, we used to use the gym, and all the children and the staff would assemble on the Christmas Day, and we'd have games and all this. Fantastic time. Food was fantastic. But in my mind, it was all spoilt the following morning, because the following morning, when we'd line up for to go into breakfast, one of the women would come out and she'd have a huge big white enamel jug full of Epsom salts. And in the other hand would be another small jug of licorice powder mixture, and you had to have one or the other, and there was no getting out of it whatsoever.
Right, well, moving swiftly on from that Boxing Day tradition, unlikely as it might seem, it was through being in the children's home that Cissy O'Brien got a glimpse into the world of filmmaking. When the producer of George Formby's classic No Limits needed a group of young extras for one scene, the children's home was the first place he looked.
There were half a dozen of us picked, and we had to go down and sit on the wall at the bottom of the children's home. And when the fella waved his flag, we had to get off the wall and walk across to the grandstand. They'd put a bit of a grandstand up, you know. Mm-hmm. And in the film, it looked as though George Formby was going at the speed, but he wasn't. He come from Governor's Bridge, just at normal speed, and it looked as though he was going like 60 miles an hour, and he could have run into us.
Right. You'd be enjoying that then?
Oh, we did. We had great fun.
Did you get any money for it?
I think it was 2 shillings, and it felt that big in my hand, you know, that 2 shillings. I thought, oh, it was like winning the lottery.
Because you wouldn't be used to having money as kids.
Oh, we never got any money, no.
No. Did you get to meet George Formby then?
Yes, oh God, yes.
Yeah?
He was marvellous to us. We weren't allowed to go and sit on the bike or anything like that.
No. What about Florence Desmond?
Oh God, he hated her. She was shifting us away. Go away from me, go away, you orphans. Get these orphans away from me. And I went up to, you know, being very cheeky. I said, I'm not an orphan, my daddy's still alive. And I was going to kick her, but I didn't.
She didn't get on with George Formby, did she?
Oh, they were bitter enemies. And I don't know how you couldn't get on with George Formby. Very easy-going man.
She didn't think he was very bright, you know.
He was all right, you couldn't kid him.
Well, there may have been similarities in their childhood, but their working life was very different. For Inkerman, it was 40 years in the world of politics, including many years as a councillor in various Douglas wards and a year as the Mayor of Douglas. Cissy also had a full working life with a variety of jobs, but she also managed to raise a family of 7 children.
Yeah, well, we couldn't afford a telly.
Why is that famous emporium of inspired domestic embellishments and unusual gifts of class and distinction called the Port Erin Gaslight and Aerated Waters Company, when it doesn't sell gaslight, and it doesn't sell aerated waters, and its premises are situate in Castletown and Ramsey? Answers on a tasteful Victorian postcard, please.
Well, it's not just the stories that are vintage in the archive room. On the shelf marked A for advertising, we've got lots more like that. Now let's move along the shelves to the TT Races archive to get an insight into how Manx Radio actually began broadcasting race commentaries. It all began in the year 1965, and in this conversation, David Collister is joined by Charlie Webster, Manx Radio's senior producer, and Geoff Cannell, legendary TT race commentator.
TT, the tourist trophy. We better start with Charlie because you actually go back right to the time when Peter Neal had started his commentaries on Manx Radio in 65.
First TT 65. We weren't allowed into the grandstand. We were completely barred by the BBC and the ACU. And we weren't allowed in the grandstand, so we borrowed the large green commentary box, which used a Timmel in those days, double-decker, and we put that alongside the cemetery, and we were in there. Stuart Lord did the commentary from Ballacrane, and it was an awful commentary position. He was in the pub, and he said to me, how would I know when the riders were coming? I said, well, watch the BBC chap pick his lip mic up, and when he picks his up, they're on their way. And then we had a van, I think, at Balath on the forecourt of the garage on the left-hand side there, which is another awful commentary position. You couldn't see anything. And then we had Ian Cannell up at the bungalow, highest point on the course.
You were engineering?
I put all the equipment out.
What else did you have to do during the course of the race itself then?
Well, you just had to be on hand in case anything went wrong, in case the transmitters would go off at Foxdale, which, I mean, they weren't 100% reliable in those days. Go out in the morning, first thing about 6:30, go up to the bungalow. Years and years ago then, I mean, senior race day, there was hundreds of people walking up Hilbury. So you used to put the equipment in there, and then you'd go down through Felty Will, then to Balath.
So, presumably, from the broadcast point of view, the programme was controlled by the main presenter, Peter Neal.
Peter Neal, yes, he was the anchor.
So everybody picked up their cues from him?
Yes.
Geoff, you started, I think you had told me, as a timekeeper then, did you?
Yes, I went out to Ballacrane, by which time they'd had a proper commentary box put up there on scaffolding. That was all right there. It was a bit difficult to get into the box, though. You had to get up on a wall and then sort of across the top of a hedge and leap in through the back of it. And that was 1968 timekeeping for Jack Cretney. And 68, 69 and 70, which were the 3 years I did at Ballacrane timekeeping, were fantastically hot. So hot that it was 100 degrees in the box, and you had to have the back door closed because there were speakers outside which would feed back.
Yeah.
And you just couldn't do your mental arithmetic on the times because it was so hot. As soon as you opened the door and the air came in, you could go back to normal service. So I did that, and then in 1970, the last race was the senior, and there'd been, I think, a 125 race in the morning, and Jack's voice went, and they rang from the grandstand and said, give Geoff a go. because I'd already, of course, done the 69 Manx Grand Prix at the bungalow, so they knew I could do the stuff. But to be chucked into the senior race was a thrill for me. But I got through, and one thing I do remember is that Agostini was winning, and he came round Ballacrane and the machine coughed a bit, and I said, sounds like one of the carburettors is a bit out of adjustment. And I was very pleased when he said at the end, well, I wasn't able to go quite as quick as normal because one of the carburettors was out of adjustment.
You had to be a motorcyclist to know that.
You did, yeah.
What were the toilet facilities at these commentary positions round the course? And presumably at Ballacrane you could get into the pub, could you?
Well, you could, or the people that had the private house nearby were very kind of Manx Radio, and in fact they fed and watered them.
Who were the other commentators in the early days?
Ken
Lees.
Yeah.
And Ian Cannell.
Well, of course, Ian was with it for a long time,
he was with Colburn, of course, wasn't he?
Well, Colburn's actually put a pretty good system out to start with, long before Manx Radio, and it was very comprehensive. They had about 10 commentary points. They were all over the show.
Yeah.
And, of course, you'd have the BBC doing it as well, David Leigh, and Bertie Reed and people like that. But it was very Ken Wolstenholme, very precise, and here comes now...
But it was only intermittent, wasn't it? It wasn't a continuous commentary, I don't think.
Well, Colburn's was, I think.
I think it was Colburn's.
Was it?
Yeah.
Round the course commentary.
Yeah.
It was very, very far before
and
its time.
And that was used by John Grayson for the very first coverage that Manx Radio had. It's the only way they could cover it in 1964.
Yeah, they came to an arrangement with Coley and picked up his feed, I suppose, people like Dolan Kelly were out at Sulby. And
it wasn't very good commentary, because I remember being at Fox and Lanes at the time, and we just got a new big stereo radiogram, and this chap would come on and say, in the lead is number 17, followed by number 16 and number 32.
Yeah, and you wouldn't know who they were. They didn't have a programme.
That must have been one of the difficulties for commentators, because there's not a lot of time between looking to see which number 37 is.
Well, once you get used to it, you don't need to, of course.
No.
You know them by sight. But the Manx Grand Prix is different. You need to look at the programme. But it is an art which you can do by averting your gaze, same as when you're doing anything else on a microphone you can read at the same time. But one of the problems, of course, in those days was that the fast riders weren't always at the front. Nowadays, the fast men are all in the top 30 riders. But then they used to be spread throughout the field, so you could have number 2 leading the race and number 99 running second, and of course there wasn't enough time on air at the points to get them all through, so the whole thing was always running full Nakilia, and but it was all right for the time with what equipment there was and what knowledge there was.
You also had the situation as a commentator where they'd hand over to you and expecting a certain rider to come through, and he hadn't appeared, and you had to fill out and pad out.
Jeff was a master of that.
Yes.
I mean, the trick is to fill in and try and make it sound interesting. You can't have dead air, and at Balaf Bridge with a Formula 3 race, it would be 8 minutes before the riders got to the bungalow. Well, there'd only be 20 riders in it, so they'd long gone through Balaf, the last one of those, and we never quite got round to describing the seagulls flying around, but it wasn't far off at times.
About Balaf, I mean, George Lehman, the landlord of the pub, we eventually moved into the pub upstairs in the lounge.
Yeah,
it was in his own lounge, which is very kind of him, really. And when there were postponements, of course, you were lying around for hours out there in his living room. And then, of course, he would start up on the electric organ downstairs, which gave a novel twist to the commentary. And he would have the horse racing on full blast on the television as well. And,
did we pick that up on air as well?
Well, you could hear it in the background. It was all part of the fun of it. I used to actually give the horse racing results out just to fill in. But you couldn't see that much because it was a great view of the bikes coming down to Balaf. They jumped the bridge and then you didn't know what happened to them. Well, if anybody's going to crash at Balaf, it's after they've taken the bridge. But you couldn't see what had happened to them. You just had to wait and see if the marshals were running.
There were wonderful days, weren't they, in the 60s and 70s?
Well, I was at Balaf for 17 years, of course. I mean, I did Ballacrane with Jack for the 70 senior. Then I moved to the bungalow for the Manx and did the Manx a couple of years, 3 years up there, I think. And then when Ken Leash packed in, I went to Balaf and made that my home for 17 years. And it was the best place on the course. Always exciting.
I mean, there must have been some really hairy times where things went wrong.
One of the things that went wrong badly one time was that there was a postponement, and it was so long a postponement that I went home from the grandstand and they said the next announcement will be at 1:30, the roads will close at 2 and the race will start at 2:30. So about 1:15 I set off for the grandstand, got to St Ninians and found the road shut. They'd advanced the race by half an hour, which was totally illegal because the announcements on Manx Radio carried the full force of a road closing statutory order. Anyway, they let me across, and I had the hare then all the way up Ingebrek and down Druidale to get to Balaf. The race had started as I was still going down Druidale. Anyway, I screeched to a halt in the Glen Road at Balaf, ran across, jumped into the box, and they said, now to Geoff Cannell, and the bikes were coming down the road. That was tight.
Had you been able to listen to the commentary in your car on the
Yes,
way?
I had.
That's
yeah,
fortunate.
that made it worse. You knew then how near they were getting to Ballaugh. They were certainly through Ballacrane while I was still driving down the road at the end of Druiddale. Another time, I rode in the Classic Parade in the morning, and then I had to get to Ballaugh for the race, and I didn't allow myself enough time, and I was still dressed in full racing leathers, driving a mini pickup at about 70 down Druiddale to get there. And I hadn't had anything to eat, and I said on the air, I haven't had a time for lunch. And the ladies from the Methodist Church, who ran a sort of thriving business selling teas and that in the hall nearby, came round. But the trouble was, they came round to the back of the box and they were hammering on the back door of the commentary box, and we were live on air, and I had my foot against the door, and she was stood outside with sausage and chips and jelly. So eventually, anyway, we dragged this lot in and managed to devour that.
That's an interesting thing, though, Charlie. I mean, these commentators were stuck there all day, weren't they?
Oh, yes.
What happened? Did they get lunch? Did they get drinks? Did they
lunch? You bring your own sandwiches in your flask. If you didn't take them for yourself, you've had it, mate. There's no toilet facilities at the bungalow. I mean, you just had it.
Yeah, at Ballaugh, you actually had to cross the river, which reminds me of an incredible thing. When computers first came out, Charles Gard produced this computer, and he said, you don't need stopwatches and all that. You can time the riders by a computer, all preset. So he turns up with this thing about 20 feet square and hundreds of yards of cable, and said, where's the power plug? Well, there wasn't one. So he had to put Wellingtons on and feed a great cable under Ballaugh Bridge and right through to Mr. Mundell's house across the road.
When you look back, we were pioneers, really, weren't we, in the 60s?
Well, actually, it held the race together because it's so important to know who's leading it. And in the old days, you would send a car round at the end of the race to people who'd finished first, second and third, their numbers written on the back bumper of the Roads Open car. That was the only real way people knew who'd won. Then came Colburn's, then the BBC, then Manx Radio. But of course, Manx Radio was able to do amateur timekeeping, which was very, very good. The O'Hanlon boys were absolutely spot on to the second. And now, of course, it's all done automatically by transponders. But it was a great way of keeping people informed. And, of course, all the people signalling the riders as to how they were doing all totally depended on Manx Radio.
Behind the scenes at the TT races, Manx Radio's senior producer Charles Webster and TT race commentator Geoff Cannell giving David Collister an insight into how they pioneered coverage of the TT races on Manx Radio. When we get into the summer months in the archive room, our thoughts turn to the TT and tourism. Well, we've just had some great TT nostalgia, so how about a couple of stories from two very different Douglas neighbours, who I think could rightly be regarded as pioneers in the island's tourist industry. One is the Falcon Cliff Hotel, the other is Cunningham's Camp. And in 1990, David Collister asked Jack Nivison, a member of the tourist board for some 20 years, to tell him the story of the holiday success that didn't actually start out as a business at all.
The first camp was at Gowdall. It was known as the House-Trek Camp. And it was set up by Joseph Cunningham, who was the father of camping as we know it throughout the world. Billy Butler only started some 40 years after Joseph Cunningham was going, and he was bringing over certain people to the Isle of Man. In the early stages, they were kind of charitable and benevolent people that were looking after youngsters, perhaps, who had done something wrong, and they were taking them over a holiday and trying to improve them. And Joseph Cunningham set up this camp, and he thought it was an idea to turn it into a business, set it up commercially and advertised it throughout Britain. On your application form, you had to sign the pledge.
Did you?
An essential that no alcohol should be consumed, not only on the premises, but whilst they were on holiday in the Isle of Man during this period. And it was for boys only, of course. Joseph Cunningham ran this camp, eventually went to Little Switzerland, and he set up there, and they were largely tented in the early stages. And he accommodated something like 60,000 young people during the season. And these were provided with concerts and dancing and tennis and swimming and all the rest of it. And not once during the whole of that time did they have to call the police in for any trouble.
So there was a rigid regime then to make sure that they didn't drink?
Yes, indeed. Yes, people could be sent home if they were found to have drink. And another thing too, the place was well policed during the night. And the lights went out at 11:45 every night, apart from Sunday. They went out at 10:30 then. And any of them that were out and about after that time, they were giving their marching orders. These tents were the bell tent, with the pole up the middle, and in busy times they would have 8 in one of these tents, all their feet going towards the centre. They had boards underneath them, and they had a mattress. And the only other furniture that was in the whole place was a small mirror on the centre pole, you see, so that they could have a look at themselves when they got up in the morning. They had latrines in a special place, you see, which were kept spotlessly clean and so forth. And the place was very well run and very well kept. The entrance was quite a beautiful entrance. They had what they call a fernery there, with lots of ferns and so forth. And the general public were invited on certain days of the week to come and inspect and walk right through the camp. A lot of people used to go regularly to the Sunday concerts. They had an orchestra playing at every meal. It was the largest dining room in the Isle of Man. At any one time, they could go up to 4,000. And most of the staff, they were dual-purpose staff. They were painters, perhaps in the winter time, or plumbers and all the rest of it. And they put aprons on them and little dicky bows on them in the summertime, and they waited on the tables.
Some of them were also musicians, were they?
Yes, one of the greatest acts they had in the Cunningham's camp were the Horbury brothers. Well, they weren't brothers, actually. It was grandson, father, and grandfather. And they used to play concertinas, these ones. They used to swing round in the air, and they'd play all sorts of wonderful melodies. And they got a great reception. Now, in the winter time, of course, there was no need for them. They used to come to church for fairs in the Isle of Man. Many people will remember them.
Now, what about girls? They didn't have girls at all then?
No, it didn't have girls, and they didn't have bars and drink.
When these lads left the camp to go into the town, then there'd be girls
Yes.
looking to them, maybe, and a few drinks taken then, surely.
Well, I don't know about the drinks. They would go around the town in numbers, linked up together, like arm in arm, 6 or up to a dozen of them, walking along on the promenade, and they would encircle a couple of girls that were coming along and have a little bit of fun with them. And it might then mean an introduction to one another, but they were very well behaved. People would send their young sons over to the Isle of Man, staying at Cunningham's camp, and they knew they'd have a jolly good time, and they knew they had to behave themselves. It was very cheap, too. It was 2 guineas a week. This was all found, 2 guineas. This was there for their bed, for their meals. They used to have some jokes about it, you see. They were very fond of ham, you see, the sliced ham. And the boys used to sing, "What did we have for supper last night? Cunningham." "What did we have for dinner? Cunningham." In the early stages, it was very hard going. But subsequently, there were profits announced, something like 37,000 a year they were making. Enormous money in those days, you see. As the years went by, they had less and less of the tents and more chalets and the accommodation in apartments in the buildings as they built them along. This continued right until 1939, and the camp was subsequently taken over by the Admiralty, and in 1945 it was subsequently sold, and the Douglas Young Men's Camp, Cunningham ceased to have any interest in it. And most people that worked at the camp have very happy memories of working. They tell some funny stories, but they're very happy memories of working there.
Jack Nivison, former Tourist Board member, talking with David Collister about Cunningham's camp. When the camp moved from Groudle to Little Switzerland, its near neighbour was the Falcon Cliff Hotel. And as Eva Kane tells the story of another pioneer in the tourist trade, listen carefully for what she has to say about girls and alcohol and the young men from Cunningham's camp. Eva Kane had a very successful career as an entertainer on stage and screen.
I'm looking at the Roy Hudd's Cavalcade of Variety Acts, and on page 92, under the letter K, it says Eva Kane, siffleuse, lady whistler and soprano, born Isle of Man 1923, and apart from a most melodious whistling routine of pop, she would then break into a coloratura vocal and usually stop the show. Her act was one of the first to be televised after the Second World War. Her family owned hotels on the Isle of Man, where, I believe, she retired.
But it's not actually Eva's show business career that we're talking about now, but the work of her parents. Eva was born in 1923, But the story she now tells begins in 1919 when her parents became the owners of the Falcon Cliff Hotel.
Your mother was Ellen, was she? Ellen Kane?
Yes, she was Ellen Kane, but in the hotel business she became known as Caney, and nobody called her anything else.
And your father was Leo?
My father was Leo. My father had been away during the war years. He was in the RASC, and he had been sent out to Africa, and he actually got lost there. Through illness, his papers went missing. He had smallpox, and he was being nursed by the natives, and all his paperwork had been lost. And Mother, in the meantime, was managing a big estate down in Fairbourne for Sir Peter Peacock, who was the man who started the Peacock's stores. Sir Peter and Mother came over to the island to have a look at 2 hotels which Mother wanted to have. It was either Falcon Cliff or the Colby Glen, and she decided on Falcon Cliff, which was known not as a white castle but a white elephant. Nobody had ever been able to make it pay. It was because you couldn't get to it. You had to walk up Palace Road to get on the one side, or on the other side you had to walk up well over 100 steps up the side of the cliff.
Yes.
Mother and Dad had been in there from 1919, but it certainly wasn't paying because of the difficulty to get to it.
It was much easier for the holidaymakers to stay down on the promenade?
Much easier, yes.
Yeah.
The only ones we did get were the boys coming from Cunningham's camp, who used to bring the girls from the promenade up to Cunningham's camp for the dance in the morning. And when it came up to lunchtime, the boys were taking the girls back down the steps to the boarding houses on the promenade for lunch.
Yeah.
And so they came through the hotel and had a beer on the way, which they weren't allowed to have up in Cunningham's camp,
right,
of course.
Yes. But it must have been your parents then that organised the Falcon Cliff lift?
Yes. My mother decided that we must have some sort of means of getting the people up to us, and it turned out to be this Wadsworth's lift. Man from Croydon came over to build the lift, which is classed as a railway because it has a track to it. And from then on, the hotel started to pay. Right. Mainly because there was a novelty of getting up and down to the hotel by the lift. And also, my mother wrote during the winter months to 13 different TT riders companies. Mm-hmm. And she got 13 replies and 13 bookings. And that started off big clientele for the TT races every year for the Manx Grand Prix.
She was a woman of foresight who realised that something had to be done to make this place pay then?
Yes. She was a very good businesswoman.
How much would they have paid for it in 1919, do you know?
It was somewhere around about £250,
really?
Something as silly as that, because it didn't pay.
Yeah.
You know, it was, as I say, a white elephant and not a white hotel.
She was determined to make it pay.
Yes, she was a very determined lady.
And David Collister met another very determined lady when he went to an anniversary celebration at Marown School and met former teacher Mrs. Annie McArd.
When did you actually start at Marown School? Can you remember?
1927 it must have been.
How long were you there?
About till 1934 I got married.
What were youngsters like in those days? I mean, you didn't have the discipline.
Well, they'd not much discipline. That's what I had to try and do, bring a bit of discipline to their lives. They were used to walking around the classroom and do what they like. Get back to your seat, please. I've never seen children walking around ad lib like this. And they liked it. They didn't mind. I got on well with them.
Table manners worried you as well, didn't they?
Oh, the table manners were terrible. I used to go in when they were having their meal in my room, you see, and there'd be like a cow drink.
Give us an example. Do that with your tea. You've got it here now. What did they do? Were they as bad as that?
Much worse than that.
So how did you settle that one?
Well, I said, put your cups down. Now then, let me see you take a drink. So I took a drink and held it up to my mouth by the handle. That's what the handle is for. Lift it up. And you know, they got accustomed to doing that, and that was made right. Then on Friday afternoon, we had a little tea party, groups of 4, lots of little tea parties. Some of them brought biscuits, you see, and I brought some little cakes or scones. Now I said, if your neighbour hasn't anything to eat, pass something to her, don't just dive in yourself.
So that's how they learned to sit at the table properly?
Yes, they did. And another thing, they had to come across the fields in winter, ploughed fields, to get to school, and their feet were covered in mud. I said, we can't have this, you know. But they thought that was just the thing to do. I sent them out into the porch, 2 at a time, and if they weren't done properly, back again. Eventually we got all their shoes clean. Then their mouth covered with jam from breakfast. They hadn't washed themselves. Oh, good gracious, let me see. Oh, you're sticky. And then you're handling books with your sticky fingers. Go and wash your hands and wash your mouth.
The archive room is full of funny and fascinating stories. But for me, some of the most touching stories came from Leslie Garrett as he reflected on the years when his father, Robert, was steward on the Calf of Man in the mid-1930s. Although Leslie was only 3 years old when they went there and was 7 when they left, he has vivid memories of an adventurous childhood, even though the living conditions were very basic.
He was Robert Garrett, he was a steward, 3 children.
I was the oldest, then Michael, then Maureen, and then the other girl that was born on the calf was Violet.
Yeah.
And the certificate I've just shown you, that was Kathleen.
So there were 2 born on the calf?
Yes, 2. And no doctors.
Where's the midwife?
My father. When he was asked, how did he know how to bring a child in, and of course he tied the biblical cord himself with a navy knot, apparently, with a figure of 8 and cut it. And he said, well, the birth of a cow, he said, was 9 months, and he said he didn't think there was any difference. So that's how he put it, but when people were reading it, he thought he was pretty crude, but that's how he put it.
Now, how did you get your supplies then?
My father used to go once a fortnight across. And I can remember on one occasion, and this is when the motorboat that was on the calf, which was left there by Popperwell, it got knocked out of the boathouse by a big storm, and we lost the motorboat. The last year, I think, my father was rowing. We were a fortnight or 3 weeks without food. Of course, there was plenty of eggs and stuff like that, but one of the things my father did, I don't know whether you remember, but you know how you get this stuff called Uvica? It's like a cornflake, but it's what you feed cattle and the hens and all that. Yeah. And it's a shape like cornflake. Right. My father put that in boiling water to get all the bran out of it. Yeah. And he made that into a thin cake. And that's what we had. You had to go with an egg or whatever. There was nothing else.
Was there running water there or not?
Yes, there was. I think it come out of a big tank.
The rainwater?
Yeah. And electric.
Electricity?
Electric was on as well. That was caused by the big windmill and generator.
Yeah.
The blades all broke on that in 1938, so we just had oil lamps.
So only oil lamps?
Just oil lamps, yeah. And then there was also a telephone on. Telephone line to start with. That went in the storm. So after that there was no links. But when you come to look at it, Daddy really didn't have any experience of electricity or boatmanship. It was only like Ned Madrill that gave him all that when he went on, and he was very good to Dad. He came on and showed him different things.
You were telling me a marvellous thing about a horse that had decided to eat some green corn.
Oh yeah, well, the bruet, which is a young corn about 2 inches high, and my uncle was over at the time, and the horse was lying sort of on its side, couldn't get up because it was full of wind.
What, had it been eating the corn?
Eating the corn, eating the bruet, and it was my father come out and saw it there, and then he got my uncle to sit on it, and he jabbed it with the pitchfork, and it was running around the blooming field, making the noises.
Dispatching its wind, was it?
It was quite loud, and I can remember it, and it was a bit of a laugh, I think, to me. And Uncle Henry was petrified on the horse. And then the ship that went aground there called the Mary Burra, I don't really know whether that went aground while we were on or while it was already there, but I can remember him bringing a box about 18 inches by a foot high, and it had 2 sets of drawers in it, and a lid that opened like that. Now all in the top was the needles, the stitching and everything, iodine, gentry violet, all that in it. So when that was brought and any of us got a cut, my mother wouldn't say go and get the medicine chest. She would say go and get the Maryborough.
Yeah.
That's what she said. Every time that somebody was cut, she'd give us a dab of the gentry violet or the iodine, which we didn't like. It was probably strong stuff in them days. And that's what she called it, the Maryborough. That was off the boat. That was in the captain's thing in the boat, or the skipper of the boat.
Your mother must have been quite a tough woman to be able to live and work down there in the Calf.
Well, she was really. She came from Yarmouth. She was of a seafaring family. Her father was a sailor. I think he eventually was in the Royal Navy, and then he jumped ship in New Zealand, and then he was pardoned for the First World War and came back, and he was on sailing ships after that. And then because of the conditions, with I think there was 5 of a family altogether, and he was at sea that often, my mother's mother ended up on the gin. Because at that time, my mother had to go into a home. She went in a Catholic home. And that's how mother learnt all her bits and pieces, was from the nuns. So she was there until 18, which they asked her then, you know, you get the chance of becoming a nun if you wanted it. My mother didn't. She went into domestic work. And she came to the Isle of Man at 19, and that's when she met Dad. She was a barmaid in the Sulby Glen. But my mother, she could do anything. She also could sing lullabies. This is one of them, and from what I know is very old, and it starts:
Gentle moon that gives us light through the darkness of the night, will you kindly tell us, pray, where you go to in the day? In your starry nest, do you ever rest?
Good night, Mr. Moon. I shall have to go and leave you. Good night, Mr. Moon. Come again and see me soon. And when you're asleep, through the window pane you'll peep. You'll wake up and call out, good night, Mr. Moon.
And Leslie Garrett was absolutely right. Good Night, Mr. Moon is a lullaby from the early 1900s. What a precious memory. You've been listening to the best of the archive room so far, and the programme's title is more than a nod to the fact that there are still more treasures lying undiscovered in Manx Radio's store of nostalgia. But now it's time for us to leave, to close the door and return to the present day. This is Judith Lay saying thank you for listening, and if you want to hear any of today's stories in full, you'll find that every episode of the archive room is available as a podcast for you to listen at your leisure. Just search for the archive room at manxradio.com or via your usual podcast provider.
The Nation Station.